We are ready to get going. All right, everyone. Welcome so much. We're so pleased to have you here this evening. I'm Gretchen Hochmeister, the Executive Director of the Hotchkiss Library, and we're very pleased to see you here on behalf of everybody from the library. We ask you to please stay muted during the initial part of our program this evening. So if your mic is not muted, please turn your mic off now. I will ask some questions to Laurie. She's going to read a short section from the book, and then we will have a couple more questions and then open the floor for your questions. So if anything occurs to you while we're speaking, please feel free to type it in the chat box, and we will then pose those questions to Laurie in a little while. We love hosting book-related events at the library, but we love it even more when we're able to welcome somebody who's from Sharon, and especially someone who's given so much of their time and talent to our library. Laurie is a former board member of the Hotchkiss Library, and almost, I would say even more importantly, she chaired the annual Sharon Summer Book Signing for 3 years. And having done that myself, I can tell you that it is a huge job, and she did an amazing job organizing that large and complex event. She continues to be involved at the library and is a big supporter. So it's even extra special to have her with us this evening. She has been a writer for most of her adult life, beginning as a journalist at a time when that was not an easy path for a young woman, but she truly found her voice as a biographer. She has now written 6 books, 5 of those she completed while living in her house on the Green in Sharon. The first 2 were biographies, Portrait of an Artist, a biography of Georgia O'Keeffe, then a biography of the extraordinary sculptor Louise Nevelson, A Passionate Life. She then turned to more introspective works and published 4/10 of an Acre, Reflections of a Gardening Life, and Without Child, Challenging the Stigma of Childlessness. And she then went on to write a history of girls' education at her alma mater, the Westover School here in Connecticut. I was thinking earlier today that I first met Laurie when I moved to Sharon about 21 or 22 years ago, and she facilitated a book group that was hosted by the Hotchkiss Library of Sharon on the topic of all things women's memoirs. So here we have come full circle all these years later. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Laurie and to speak with her tonight about her new memoir, Word for Word, A Writer's Life. It's a brave and introspective book. She's not afraid to share her weakness and vulnerability and to examine choices that she's made and maybe things that in retrospect she might have done differently. It's a beautiful examination of her career and her life. And there are also some great anecdotes. I don't know about those of you who know her, but I never knew that she was once given a ride by the champion heavyweight boxer Joe Frazier in his white convertible Corvette. That's a story I never heard. So you learn all kinds of fascinating things when you read this book. So welcome, Laurie.
Thank you.
We're so happy you're here. People have long discussed the difference between autobiography and memoir. Can you tell us what you think the difference is and what memoir is to you?
Oh, yes. Well, memoir is a much more personal, subjective approach to telling the story of your life. It can very often be focused on one theme. An autobiography is more like a history. It's something a president would write about his career. Whereas a memoir is a slice of life. It goes very deep and very personal.
Great. And what are the challenges of suddenly being the subject of your work, right? Changing the lens from investigating other people's lives to your own life.
It's a big challenge. I found that to go back and look at my younger self was at times it was difficult. At times it was fun. It was always challenging. Here was this young woman who was making all these decisions. Some were good decisions and some were terrible decisions. And I knew what was going to happen to her. So it was very, very different than writing about another person where your perspective is expanded. I mean, you're in that person's world, in their city, in their village, and they're dealing with their work. And suddenly when you're writing a memoir, you're dealing with your own milieu, your own work. It's very different. You go deep. Instead of going wide, you go deep.
And you had to make a shift from third person to first person, right?
Yes. It feels risky too.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the biggest difference between writing a memoir and writing a biography is memory. You certainly have a whole resource of memories that you can draw on.
Mm-hmm.
They can sometimes lead you in the wrong direction, and you have to be careful that you are remembering right, that you're not remembering the wrong things. And so that was really the difference. And I found it actually harder to write about myself and having to deal with memory than to write a biography, because you're basically dealing with facts and other people's papers and what other people tell you and what the subject tells you. So it was very complex and risky.
Right. Must have been scary. This might be a good point for you to read to us. I think you were going to read from the introduction, because that tells us about your process and how you started thinking about those memories and finding those memories.
Yes. This is, I'm going to start with this part where it says, memoir has been called the literature of interiority. A 19th century memoirist, Henry David Thoreau, who indexed his very lengthy journals by hand so he could mine them for material, described the American tradition of private writing, which includes captivity and slave narratives, as well as ministers' spiritual reflections, as a meteorological journal of the mind. Memoir also promises to be literary alchemy. Even though you cannot change the past, you can enlarge your understanding of it. I wrote this memoir to ask, why had love failed and why had it flourished? What made my words dry up and what made them flow? When emotions and experiences are pinned down on paper and put into pixels, they become a little more distant from the heart and the head, and therefore easier to understand. The genre of memoir is inevitably about the nature of memory. Remembrance, or what is not written down, can be dreamlike, infused by imagination, and fallible by definition. While memory and perception may be imperfect, what is remembered is what's meaningful in the mind of the memoirist, and it is as important as fabrication in novels and facts in biography. When writing word for word, I did not rely on memory alone, but on more than 40 handwritten journals I had kept since college. I entered long passages into my computer. It ended up being more than 300,000 words by the end, so I could easily search them to make sure my remembering and my retelling were right, while reminding myself that even words written extemporaneously were impressions and interpretations of what happened. Over the years, my journals became less private testimony and more about the act of writing. This has enabled me to reflect in depth on the demanding and deeply rewarding aspects of the writing life. To jog my memory, I returned to my hometown of Providence to read newspapers and see photographs published when I lived and worked there. I looked at old home movies, photograph albums, school reports, family documents, and there was even a pale blue volume called Philip and Persis, the names of my grandparents, and uncle's account of their Yankee lives of my maternal grandparents. In the libraries of New York, I researched historical events like the civil rights and women's liberation movements that I had participated in when I lived in the city. And when I moved to Connecticut, I kept a big black trunk in my barn with bundles of old letters I had saved out of affection for their senders and my respect for the written word. I had thought that as a writer, I might need them someday, and I was right. What remains private are details unnecessary to tell the truth, and what has become publishable are stories essentially about what really happened. Working on my memoir was like writing a very long letter to myself. By the end, the relationship between my younger and older selves was reciprocal. While the girl shaped my life today, the woman framed her story. That teenage girl wanted to look back at herself with compassion and with what she called illumination. And I believe this memoir would please her. Writing word for word has been an extraordinary experience of remembering, finding the right words for what happened, and making me a little wiser, and then allowing the past to recede again. So that gives you a little idea of what I was doing all those years in my house here on the green.
Thank you. That's fabulous. Did you write the book for yourself, or did you write it when you set out to do it? Did you intend to publish it?
I wrote it for myself. I wanted, I had reached the point in life where I wanted to look back and make sense of what I had done and where I had been, people I had known, experiences I had. It just it's been called a time of the desire for deepened understanding, and so it felt very natural, and I felt very curious, and I really regarded it as a personal act.
Mhm.
I didn't really think about publishing until recently.
That's interesting. Did you revise it when you decided to publish? Did you do anything differently?
I revised as I went along.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm a professional writer, so somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew I was going to publish this. It wasn't the main reason for
Mhm.
writing it.
Your other great passion in life is gardening, and you've written, of course, about your lovely garden just off the green in Sharon. How does gardening impact your writing? How is gardening like writing? What is the relationship of the two?
Well, what's so interesting about writing and gardening is that they're totally different, and yet they're totally complementary. Writing exercises the brain, the gardening exercises the body. Writing is so cerebral, and gardening, of course, is very active. And so I really use both of them to make the other better.
Mhm.
After a morning of writing, it was just really so important and wonderful to go out and sort of work off my energy and just dig and weed and water and all those things. It was very relaxing. I could rest my mind and sort of act in a kind of instinctive way. And then I get tired, and so the next morning I was very glad to sit still and recover from all this activity, and I was in a good state of mind to just sit and write, think, until the afternoon came around.
And what was it like when you combined the two and you wrote about gardening?
Well, that was that was a great book to write. I had great fun with that. I felt actually a little guilty over the years that I spent so much time gardening instead of writing. I thought I would have written more books if I didn't have a garden. And so when I thought of writing a book about gardening, I thought, well, that means that all this gardening has been research. I could call it research and not feel so guilty about it. Yeah, and it was also a way to connect with my mother, who was a great gardener, and she was in her late 80s by then, and we talked a lot about our gardens, and I learned a lot from her. It was a wonderful way to connect with her, and then I dedicated the book to her. So.
That's great. My favorite part of the book was your long section on your Georgia O'Keeffe biography and the whole story behind the research, and you really took a huge risk. It was your first book, and you left a regular paycheck and the security of that regular paycheck to go out on your own. And you set out, did you still have your Carmen Gia, or was it
your? Oh yes, I had
my Carmen Gia. And you headed out to the Southwest you went down to the South, and you stopped at all these places that had impacted her, right? And it was a huge challenge. So I think maybe that's why I really loved hearing those stories. And you're obviously very much drawn to artists. You've written biographies of 2 women artists, and you're married to an artist. So how does the work of the visual artist, how is it like your work or not like your work? And what do you think your attraction is to art?
Well, I always found artists wonderful. My first artist I knew was when I was a little kid, and I was taking art lessons, and he was a bohemian in Providence in the 50s, and my family was not bohemian at all. It was very bourgeois, and he was having such a wonderful time. And I had an uncle who was an artist, who was a free spirit and enjoyed himself and was, passionate about his work. And I just thought artists lived with more intensity, and they had more fun than other people. I love their independence and their dedication to self-expression. And so I was drawn to O'Keeffe in the early 70s. It was also a time when the women's movement was happening in New York, and here was this woman who had this huge body of wonderful work, had succeeded in her career, and I wanted to know more about her, and it was a fascinating experience, really. So I've learned a lot. Okay, and as far as what's the difference between writing and painting, say, they're very different. I mean, words are, very direct. We use language all the time. Imagery is different. But I've got to say, the relationship is more between my gardening and the creation of art than between, say, painting or writing. Because when I go out into the studio, into the garden, it's like going into a studio, because there's color, shape, there's form, I'm in motion. It's like, I feel like I'm an artist in a studio when I'm out in the garden. It's really, it's a pleasure. And the other thing, having lived with an artist for a long time, we have this ongoing discussion: who has more fun, the artist or the writer? Well, it's the artist who loves going to work, loves making art, loves making images, and it's almost something that it happens to a child. I mean, your child makes images before they make words, sentences. So I think it's somehow a more natural process than the act of writing, which is more learned. I think you have to learn more before you can write.
That's interesting. Do you think there was an advantage to being the biographer of two artists, but not being an artist yourself or an art historian?
Well, yes, I don't think any artist would have taken the time away from the studio to write a biography. I mean, they were having so much fun in their studios. I mean, I don't think it would have happened. I don't think you could name an artist who's written a biography of another. Or
What about
artist.
an art historian? Do you think,
well,
if you hadn't formally studied art history?
No, I hadn't. But I had worked for Newsweek, and I'd learned how to learn, about anything in depth. And so I had all these, skills as a journalist. But during O'Keeffe's lifetime, this is when I wrote the first biography of O'Keeffe. I don't think any art historian would have undertaken the job without O'Keeffe's permission. And she was not giving her permission to people. And she certainly didn't give me her permission.
Right.
But with a background in journalism, that didn't faze me. I knew how to do it. And I felt that, I also felt that not knowing O'Keeffe personally, I could be a little bit more objective about her. And there was, of course, a huge amount to read and learn. And I mean, I found an enormous amount of material. So her personality became very vivid to me. So I think, so what I did is I quoted art critics and art historians instead of trying to be one. And I think that worked. Because my interest in O'Keeffe was really, the creative life. Was, how do you forge a creative life? How do you live a creative life? How do you sustain a creative life? And in the work, I didn't have to defend or explain, but other people were doing that.
Sure. Right. Yeah. I recall that you write that you really seemed to be searching for something in her own life. You had a personal interest, right? You thought she could perhaps, her life could be a model for you, and the balance of marriage and career and creative life and all of those things and the choices that she made in her life. And you write, I think, that she was like a mentor to you, albeit an uninvolved and unwilling one.
Yes, I was in my early 30s when I started writing the book, and I was searching for a way to live that would create, happiness and success and permit self-expression and independence. And I was studying her. I really was. And I did learn some very important things. I learned about courage. I learned about taking risks. I learned about the importance of being true to yourself. All these qualities that she and Stieglitz both had in great abundance. I noticed, and I noticed what happened, what was the result of living this way. And it gave me a certain amount of courage, I would say. By the time I was 40, it didn't happen overnight.
Well, I'm sure you gained a lot of courage during the process, because she didn't make it easy for you, I know, from reading the story. So you certainly learned a lot through that experience. It was really amazing. I have one last question before we take the audience questions. I noticed that you organized the book geographically. You have 3 sections, and instead of you know, perhaps organizing it with the years, different decades of your life, even though you do write a chronological narrative. You label it first Providence, where you grew up. The second section is Manhattan, where you became a writer. And the third section is entitled Sharon. And I felt that your evocation of place is so very strong. Even in your travels, you talk about Guatemala, you talk about North Africa, and of course the Southwest. You could have easily entitled one of the sections, you know, the Southwest or Santa Fe to New Mexico. And those places had a strong pull on you, a real attraction. So can you talk a little bit about sort of this pride of place and what drew you to the specific landscapes? And is that maybe connected to your gardening or working the earth or something like that?
Well, I think we're very, very influenced by where we live, what's around us, whether it feels safe, whether it feels dangerous, whether, you know, whatever, what it looks like. I'm very aware of how things look, the quality of light. These things are very important to me. And I think that that really we're formed by what's around us. I love I love landscapes. I love the country. I love the woods. And I think that there is a relationship to gardening, wanting to make a little spot of beauty behind my house. It's all related. I mean, it seemed very natural to call the first part Providence, because I mean, not only was I born and grew up in a, you know, certain part of a New England city, it's and part of a kind of cultural life that I don't even think exists anymore. But I think, and I was very shaped by that. And when I went back to Providence after college, and worked for the Providence Journal as a reporter, I discovered all different parts of the city that I had never even seen growing up. And it made me understand my roots. It was a very important experience, actually, to develop this really deep knowledge about the city and the various cultural groups, ethnic groups that are part of it. And then, of course, Manhattan. I mean, in the 70s, late 60s and 70s was wild in a lot of ways. The country was undergoing tremendous upheaval. There was, you know, the anti-Vietnam War movement was going on. There were assassinations. There were, I mean, it was really very powerful to live in New York. And then working for Newsweek during the Watergate years was quite amazing, because I was getting all this inside information about what was going on in Washington. And then it was so wonderful to move to Sharon. You know, it was and live in a quiet place where I could write, and yet close enough to the train so I could get into New York to do research and go to museums and those other things. It's been a perfect place for me as a writer, and to live across the green from the library has been
always come when you need something.
Really great.
That's great. I think you really are a painter, but you just use words. So it's very similar. So does anybody have any questions? You can unmute yourself and ask a question, raise your hand with the raise hand function, or type it into the chat box for us to read to Laurie.
Can you hear me, Gretchen?
Yep.
Laurie, I have a question about the process of writing. Nothing like you, but I've done a little bit of writing myself. I'm a lawyer, and I find that when I'm at my desk working on a brief and I get at an impasse, I take a walk and I walk around the halls, whatever, and things come to me. Okay. And then other stuff I've done for the family, memorials, whatever, I find that my best thoughts often come when I'm moving. And I guess the question I have is, does that happen to you when you're gardening or when you're, active? Do ideas come to you, or do you separate the two?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of actually a well-known event where you have been focusing on something very intensely, and then you take a break and you relax your mind, and that's when you get ideas. That's when the ideas break through. They break through some kind of mental control that you were exerting, and they bubble up from underneath. I mean, people talk about getting great ideas in the shower, and they have to find a pen and write down whatever they're. No, but it's taking a walk, gardening, anything that where your mind is at rest after having been deeply involved in something is can be a very creative time. So
Okay. Okay.
Larry, I have a question.
She got me.
When I think about writing, I think about it being a rather solitary activity, and one that forces you to sort of come to face yourself in a way. And sometimes many of us really aren't comfortable with that. We want to move off and get active and not come in such close touch with what might be disturbing or difficult. Did you find that happen to you periodically, and then how did you deal with it?
Well, yes. Yeah, at moments it was very uncomfortable reading my journals and remembering this girl who was getting into so much trouble. And I mean, one time I was reading the journal and taking notes, and I felt like I could hardly breathe. I felt my throat was tightening up, and I thought, am I having a heart attack? I went down to the hospital, and they gave me a sedative, and I felt fine. And so, I mean, I realized I was really getting clutched up by what I was reading, what I was remembering.
Yeah.
It wasn't, but I don't mind the work of, I don't mind working alone. I mean, that is probably part of my temperament. And that part is easy. It works for me very well. It's very nice because, living with an artist who also works by himself, and then we have lunch together. So we break our solitude. And so it's not isolation by any means. It's a very pleasant quietness. So does that answer your question?
It does, yes, it does.
We have a question from Lynn. Would you like to unmute, Lynn, and ask Laurie?
Okay. So I was wondering, Laurie, I really enjoyed hearing about what the process you've been through, whether writing the 2 biographies before affected the way you approach this memoir.
Well, yes. I mean, I knew how to do research. And I had letters, I had this big trunk full of letters in the barn. I mean, which is the same thing you do if you were writing a biography. You would you'd ask for letters and try to read letters. And I did read letters that both O'Keeffe had written and that Louise Nevelson had written, letters that were written to them. So I mean, all that was, yeah, I returned to Providence to, read the local newspaper during the years I lived there, look at photographs to try to remember things. I talked to people. So I mean, there was a lot of things that were similar in just in terms of sheer research. What was different was, as I said before, memory,
Yeah.
which you can't really, you don't really know whether it's true or not. And so that was the tricky. I had to try to pin things down.
Well, it does seem to me that you did a lot more verifying of memory than a lot of memoir writers do.
Well, I had the journals. That was, and because my training was as a journalist, I really wanted to get things right. I wanted to make sure the facts were right, and the way I interpreted them was, of course, my own interpretation, but it was very important to be as truthful as I could be about other people, about myself. So it was complicated.
I'd like to say something. Laurie, I just got the book yesterday, so I began reading it last night. And my first reaction was, because this is the 5th book of yours I've read, was I'm in such good hands with this voice. There's an exactitude to your writing that doesn't take away from the lyricism. So you should be so very proud of this book. My question is, did you keep journal writing while you were writing the book? Were you keeping up to date? It's kind of a 2-part question. And in going back and looking at your journals, were you editing them? Were you putting your adult self into them and being maybe a little hypercritical?
Well, I definitely was keeping the journal as I was.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Oh, great.
I still keep it.
And did it change your voice? The fact that you were now taking all this material from the past and putting it into publishable form and, and connecting everything, did it change the way you approach journal writing?
Not really, because I consider the journal private, very private.
Right.
And so I think it basically remained the same experience. But I mean, it was different as I matured, it changed. I mean, when I was, really, really young, there'd be these explosions of feeling and, anger or joy or whatever that perhaps I didn't even understand at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And as I got older, it became more analytical, more reflective.
Well, it's a gift you're giving people because one doesn't get to be so interior to another person through words like that. I just thank you very much. It's a great book. Congratulations.
Thank you, Jean.
You're welcome.
You're on.
We have a question from Tom and Valerie, I think.
Yep.
Yes. Laurie, I'm very interested, having been there myself, in how you felt in New York City during the 70s when the women's lib movement really took off. I can remember, I think I still have a clipping from the Village Voice of Vivian Gornick's, in which she talks about the situation, the position of women generally. And I remember distinctly feeling, whoa, I don't have those problems. I don't feel discriminated against. And then as I began to wake up. And I wondered how did you greet the women's lib movement in New York City?
Well, I was exhilarated by it because I came from a very patriarchal family in Providence, where I grew up where with a stepfather who really wasn't comfortable with people talking very much around him. Everything had to be very controlled and formal. And so I had a lot to rebel against. And when I got to New York and got involved in women's lib, it was thrilling for me, because I began to see the past as something different than I had experienced it. I had felt sort of inferior as a female in this world that I came from, and suddenly I realized that those feelings were imposed. They weren't natural. And I mean, it was just a very empowering and illuminating time for me. Does that answer your question? Or
Yeah, I think so. It does in an interesting way, because my background was quite different, in which my mother was divorced and working hard. And so I was used to the idea of women having their own in life. And so I was kind of taken surprised by it, although I eventually realized that it was an extremely important movement, and extremely wide-reaching in its understanding of life and lived. And I began to notice things around me in New York, which I hadn't noticed before, about how women were not getting as much as they should from life and from their professions.
And it was particularly vivid. It was very particularly vivid for me because I went to work for Newsweek in 1970, and Newsweek had just sued management. The women in Newsweek had sued management for better jobs. There were women's jobs and men's jobs at Newsweek, and of course, the women's jobs weren't nearly as good as the men's jobs.
No. Well, in the theater, especially.
It was illegal. It was, that in 1965 there was the civil rights legislation prohibited gender discrimination in employment. So we became aware of this. But anyway, it took a long time for things to change at Newsweek. But I was just really in the middle of this turmoil. But you were in the theater, so that's a whole different world.
Well, especially doing a lot of Shakespeare and that sort of thing, where there weren't that many good roles for women. And that was something that I had always just sort of accepted. And then I began to realize that for so many generations that had been the case, that the best roles went to men often. It was unusual that the best roles went to women. And I got very angry with Joe Papp at one point, because he cast a play, a Shakespeare play, using all men, which could have had many good women's roles in it. And I remember writing him a letter and saying, how can you do this to us? We have so few roles as it is. And he wrote back and he said, well, this is how it would have been done in Shakespeare's day. I know that. But still, please, don't ignore us out here.
But we all had our different experiences. But they were all, they all revealed interesting things about gender.
Yeah, indeed.
We have a couple more questions here, Laurie. One from Carol. Since you're interested in getting your memories right, I'm interested in whether you found that your memories were sometimes wrong and what kind of moments generated inaccurate memory.
Well, when reading the journals was a reality test, because I might have remembered something long ago about a person or an incident, and when I found it described in the journal, it was sometimes quite different than what I remembered. So that was my reality check. If I couldn't find it in the journal,
Why did you trust your journals as being accurate?
well, because they were written at the time. I mean, I
Yeah,
say
but that-
I say in the introduction that even though they were written at the time, they still were my interpretation of what had happened. But
Right.
but I also say that, you know, what you experience and what you remember, what you select to remember was what is important to you, and so that has validity. That
Yeah.
even if it's not the way somebody else would remember it, that slant has great meaning for you.
Yeah, my feeling is that your journals are one kind of memory, and looking back from 40 years or whatever is another kind of memory, and both have distortions of some kind.
Yeah.
And
Well, a memoir is a personal art, and it's not like it's all going to be the way anybody else remembers it. I
No,
mean,
right.
my sister, you know, read the first part of my memoir, and you know, we went through similar experiences, but she remembered them slightly differently in some cases. But then she said that the essential truth we agreed was the same. But when I talk about accuracy, it's not so much what happened when, it's the truth of the event, the truth of the moment, if that makes any sense. Good.
Great.
And a memoir doesn't have to be, it's not a piece of, it's not a legal document, it's not an autobiography, it's not history, it's the way you remember things as much as anything. But I did, nevertheless, I did, because of my whole desire to be truthful, I did try to check myself as often as I could.
Great. We have a two-part question from Catherine. She's asking Laurie, she says, I took notes on this talk and I'd like to know if I can share them on my blog. That's her first question. She'd like to.
Well, that sounds all right.
Okay.
Does Catherine have a last name?
Catherine Patton, yes.
Oh.
And she also asks you about your involvement with the Sharon Garden Club. Was that an extra boost for inspiration in doing and enjoying your garden? Or do you feel it was more of a personal experience?
Well, I'm not sure I really understand the question, but it's been a great deal of fun to be a member of the Sharon Garden Club and share experiences with other women and men. We have some nice men members now. It really is more of a social group, social experience than it is have to do with anything else.
Great. Are there any other questions? We have a few
Yeah,
more
can I-
minutes. Yep.
Yes. Again, Laurie, getting back to the process, I don't want to come across as more erudite than I am, but I was.
Why not?
Anthony Trollope's autobiography. The man had such discipline. I don't know if you've read it, but he would get up in the morning and write. He would set himself a goal of 3,000 words, and he would set himself down and write between like 4 a.m. and 7 a.m. And people would say to him, well, you know, how can you, what happens if something, you know, you're not moved? And he would say, well, if a cobbler doesn't feel like making shoes, what does he do? And so he had this incredible discipline. He would crank out these words and a finite number every day. I mean, is that a process you can understand? And
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
okay.
you need a lot of discipline to be a writer.
Okay.
I mean, I have this schedule where I would sit down at my desk at 9 o'clock and stay there for 4 hours every day. I mean, every weekday. And you know, you don't, it is a discipline. It's a job. And it takes a certain amount of just willpower. But willpower, it becomes something else. If what you're doing is meaningful, it becomes desire. It's something you want to do every day, very much, even though it does require this sitting still, thinking hard, and getting a certain amount done every day. It's important. I mean, that's you can't do any kind of creative work unless you really apply yourself and really you know, work almost every day.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Any other questions? Last chance? No? All right,
Gretchen, I'll just ask
sure.
if we wanted to, if we hadn't signed up to buy a copy of Laurie's new book, is it too late to do so? Can we still get it?
No,
And could we maybe get one that's signed?
We're actually, yes, we can, and she will sign them right inside. So here's a copy. We will have hardcover and paperback copies both. You can order a copy for the next hour or so on our website, or you can email either Holly or myself at the library, or you can call the library tomorrow and you may order one. So we will have them, I think, by early next week, hopefully.
Thank you.
Great. So on behalf of everyone, Laurie, I'm very grateful for your discipline and your willpower. I'm happy that you do find joy in your work as well, that it's not all toil and difficulty. And we're so glad that you persevere through the hard stuff and end up with these beautiful words for all of us with a lot to learn. So thank you so much for sharing that with us tonight.
It's a pleasure.
And please don't forget our upcoming events, and stay well, everyone, and come to the library. We are open, and we have lots of great books for you. So we hope to see you all soon. Thanks again, Laurie.
Bye.